The glass hit the floor as Linda convulsed on the marble, foam at her lips while guests screamed and chaos erupted. Robert didn't move because he knew the truth that no one else in that room could imagine. The poison swirling through her veins had been meant for him, slipped into his glass by the woman who called him Dad. In that instant, celebration turned into betrayal, and every smile around him became suspect. Why would his own family try to erase him on the very night meant to honor his life's work? Stay with this story, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from, because what Robert uncovered next will leave you questioning everything about loyalty, inheritance, and blood. Robert had always trusted his instincts, the same instincts that built his company from nothing and helped him navigate boardrooms filled with men who underestimated him. Those instincts screamed the moment he caught Melissa at the champagne table. Her hand shook just enough to betray her nerves as she glanced around, convinced no one was watching. The small vial disappeared back into her purse as quickly as it appeared, but not before Robert saw the clear liquid swirl into his glass, the one with the faint chip on the rim. That chip was familiar to everyone in the family, and Melissa had counted on him reaching for it like he always did. He remembered thinking, almost with amusement, that she knew him well enough to poison him, but not well enough to realize he had noticed. He didn't flinch, didn't gasp, didn't rush to grab the glass away. Instead, he tilted his head toward an old colleague droning on about real estate trends and let his eyes linger on Melissa's performance. She smiled too broadly, waved her hand too eagerly, fussed with the napkins as if she were auditioning for the role of perfect hostess. It was clumsy, the kind of act that reeked of desperation. Robert lifted the glass she handed him, thanked her in that smooth baritone that had once closed multi-million-dollar deals, and let it hover in his hand. He pretended to sip, even let the bubbles brush his lips. But when Melissa turned to admire a bracelet on a guest's wrist, he set it down by the punch bowl. A moment later, he traded it for another, sliding his doctored glass toward Linda, Melissa's mother, who absent-mindedly picked it up without question. The weight of the betrayal settled on him like a stone pressing into his chest. It wasn't just that his daughter-in-law wanted him dead. It was that she had the audacity to plan it at his retirement party, in his own home, under the roof he had worked half a century to protect, and his son, his only child, was nowhere near stopping it. Robert had always known Andrew was weak, a man who inherited comfort without ever understanding the price of it. But weak enough to stand by while his wife poisoned his father? That was something even Robert had not prepared for. The night stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. He moved through the crowd, shaking hands, laughing at old jokes, all while the glass ticked down in Linda's hand like a loaded weapon. Robert watched her raise it to her lips, felt his stomach twist as she swallowed. 5 minutes later, she was complimenting the taste, saying it was unusual, and he knew the countdown had started. When she fell, when her body convulsed and the room erupted, Robert knelt beside her. He pressed a steady hand against her wrist as Melissa screamed for someone to call an ambulance. The foam at Linda's mouth was all the confirmation he needed. He studied Melissa's face, the frantic tears, the shrill pitch of her cries. Too much performance, not enough fear. She had practiced this. She had prepared for witnesses. The thought chilled him. He glanced at Andrew, who pushed through the crowd, pale but composed. His eyes darted to his wife for only a split second, a glance that told Robert everything. This wasn't just Melissa's scheme. Andrew knew. He might not have poured the vial, but he had given permission in the silence of complicity. At the hospital, Robert stayed close, leaning on the counter as doctors rushed Linda into a treatment room. Poisoning, they said in hushed tones. Something potent, something deliberate. Melissa paced the waiting area, her heels clicking like a metronome counting down her nerves. Andrew sat stiff in his chair, checking his phone, but never typing. Robert leaned back and let the tension coil tighter, saying nothing, letting them wonder how much he had seen. Melissa caught his eye once, her face pale, her hands trembling as she reached for her coffee. He gave her a smile, calm and dismissive, the kind of smile he had used in negotiations when he already knew he had the upper hand. But the truth cut deep. This wasn't a rival across a conference table or a stranger trying to undercut him in business. This was family, his son's wife, the woman he had welcomed into his home, the one he had written checks for, supported when her boutique jewelry line bled money. He remembered Andrew's voice asking for help with the down payment on their house. Remembered Melissa's tears about wanting the right neighborhood, the right schools. Robert had given them nearly $200,000 over the years, never as loans, always as gifts. And now here they were, plotting to erase him before he could spend the wealth he had earned. Back in his car that night, he poured himself a glass of champagne from a fresh bottle, untouched by their schemes. He let the bubbles sting his tongue and thought about the twisted irony. They believed they were clever, that age had softened him, dulled his instincts, weakened his will to fight. They had no idea who they were dealing with. He had built his empire on suspicion, on reading the smallest flicker of doubt in another man's eyes. If Melissa thought she could outplay him with poison and crocodile tears, she was about to learn what happened when you underestimated a man who had spent 70 years surviving every kind of betrayal. He sat in his study, the lights low, the glass still in his hand. The garden his late wife had tended lay dark beyond the windows, the roses barely visible in the night. He thought about the word family, how it was supposed to mean loyalty, love, protection. Tonight it meant danger. Tonight it meant enemies hiding behind familiar faces. He picked up a pen and a notepad, wrote a single line across the page in sharp, deliberate strokes. They will regret this. Outside, the neighborhood slept, unaware that inside the Wilson home, a battle line had been drawn. Robert leaned back, eyes sharp, pulse steady. The game had begun, and unlike Melissa, unlike Andrew, he had been playing longer, harder, and smarter. He would let them keep believing he was the mouse. He would let them keep circling, convinced they had cornered him. And then, when the time was right, he would show them the teeth of the old lion they thought was too tired to fight. The question wasn't whether they would try again. He knew they would. The real question, the one that kept the night electric and alive, was how far they were willing to go, and how much he was willing to lose before turning their trap into his masterpiece. And if you think the poison in the champagne was shocking, wait until you see what Robert discovered next. Melissa's scream tore through the room like glass shattering, sharp and calculated, rising above the chaos as Linda writhed on the polished floor. Guests scrambled, chairs toppled, voices overlapped, but Melissa's voice cut through with just the right amount of hysteria. "Call 911, she cried, clutching her pearls as though grief had seized her throat. Her hands trembled on cue, her mascara streaking into carefully orchestrated lines. It was a performance for the ages, worthy of an actress, but Robert had spent a lifetime watching people fake emotions to get what they wanted. He could tell when tears came from the soul and when they were pulled from a well-rehearsed script. What he saw on Melissa's face was not devastation. It was calculation. Robert stayed on one knee beside Linda, pressing his fingers to the woman's wrist, grounding himself in the thready pulse while chaos erupted above him. He felt the tremor of her convulsions ease slightly, watched her chest hit shallow breaths. He said nothing, just held steady while others fluttered around, pretending to help but doing little more than crowd the scene. Melissa knelt, but not too close. Enough for people to notice her supposed concern, without risking her dress brushing against the foam spilling from her mother's mouth. Robert's eyes slid up to her, slow, deliberate, and when she dared meet his gaze, she flinched. For a fraction of a second, the mask cracked, and there it was. Fear. Not for Linda, but for herself. Andrew pushed through the crowd, pale and sweating, the smell of his cologne cutting through the scent of spilled champagne and panic. His tie was crooked now, his voice rising in demands for space, for answers, for order. He looked at Robert, but not for long. His eyes skittered away, landing on Melissa, and in that brief flicker Robert saw it, the unspoken admission. Andrew knew. He wasn't just watching his mother-in-law convulse in shock. He was watching a plan unravel, a scheme collapse in real time. That sidelong glance between husband and wife told Robert everything words never would. The rage simmered in him, low and steady, never spilling over. Not yet. His anger was not the kind that snapped and shouted. It was the kind that cut, cold and clean. His son, his only child, had become a stranger. Andrew's jaw clenched as he muttered questions at no one in particular, playing the concerned son-in-law while keeping just enough distance from Robert's searching eyes. Robert wanted to seize him by the shoulders, shake him until truth rattled free. But he didn't. Not here. Not now. The paramedics burst through the doorway with their heavy bags and clipped voices, kneeling where Robert had been, nudging him aside with practiced efficiency. He let them take over, standing with a precision that drew no attention, and stepped back into the crowd. He watched Melissa wring her hands, listened to her strained pleas for them to save her mother, and felt bile rise in his throat. It was too polished, too perfect. He had seen panic, real panic, in the eyes of men who realized they were about to lose everything. Real panic was ugly, clumsy, desperate. This was theater. When the stretcher wheeled out, Melissa stumbled alongside it, clutching Robert's arm with claws disguised as manicured nails. "She just collapsed," she sobbed. "1 minute she was fine, the next." Her words were meant to fill the silence with confusion, to create a narrative before anyone could question what they had seen. Robert stared at her, unblinking, his silence heavier than any accusation. She faltered under it, her grip loosening, her performance slipping into the cracks between her words. Andrew placed a hand on her back, steadying her, shielding her, as though the two of them were a united front against the chaos. But Robert saw it differently. They were co-conspirators in a story that had nearly claimed the wrong victim. He studied Andrew, memorizing the twitch of his jaw, the sheen of sweat on his brow, the way his eyes kept avoiding direct contact. His son had chosen his side, and it wasn't his father's. The ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens and murmurs, the ambulance swallowed by night while Robert followed in his car. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, the city lights streaking across the windshield like scratches on glass. He replayed every moment in his mind. The vial, the switch, the collapse, the scream, and every detail tightened the noose of certainty. Melissa had tried to kill him, and Andrew had let her. At St. Mary's, Robert lingered in the waiting room, leaning on the sterile white wall, arms folded across his chest. Melissa paced, her heels a staccato rhythm across the linoleum, her voice high and sharp with rehearsed worry. Andrew sat rigid, his phone buzzing again and again, each vibration ignored, his jaw tightening each time. Robert stayed silent, watching, cataloging, dissecting. He had built an empire on reading people, and now that skill turned inward, aimed like a weapon at his own blood. When Melissa finally sat, dabbing at her eyes, Robert's gaze cut into her. She fumbled, dropped her tissue, and for a brief instant, the polished facade crumbled again. Her breathing hitched, her lips trembled, and he saw the terror she was trying to hide. She wasn't mourning her mother's collapse. She was calculating what this mistake would cost her. And Andrew, the boy he had raised, the man he had believed would carry forward his legacy, sat there complicit, silent, too cowardly to intervene, too greedy to stop. Robert thought of the nights he had worked late, the vacations missed, the birthdays spent in conference rooms, all to provide Andrew a life of security. And this was the repayment. Not gratitude, not loyalty. Betrayal. The anger hardened into something colder, sharper. Robert had faced betrayal before. Partners who tried to cut him out. Competitors who spread lies. Allies who turned coat when money whispered. But never like this. Never from his own son. The heartbreak was almost worse than the fury, an ache that pressed into his chest. But beneath it burned resolve. When the doctor finally emerged with clipped reassurances, stable, poisoned but recovering, tests pending, Melissa clutched Robert's arm again, too tightly, too deliberately. "Thank God she's alive," she whispered. He leaned down close, his lips inches from her ear, and in a voice smooth as glass, he said, "Yes, thank God." She stiffened, understanding at once that he knew. Andrew watched, silent, his eyes betraying a flicker of something. Fear, guilt, shame. Robert couldn't tell. But what he could tell, beyond doubt, was that his son had crossed a line. There was no going back. When he left the hospital that night, the air outside was sharp with cold. He pulled his coat tighter, stood for a long moment staring at the glow of the building, and thought of the road ahead. He would not shout, would not accuse. He would not stumble like a victim. No, he would play their game, bide his time, let them believe he was cornered. And then, when the moment was right, he would strike. Because this wasn't just about poison in a glass or lies in a waiting room. This was about legacy, about blood, about the unforgivable betrayal of a son who chose greed over love. Robert's breath fogged in the night as he stepped toward his car, the anger steady, the heartbreak locked deep where no one could see it. He slid behind the wheel, started the engine, and let the hum settle into his bones. The game had shifted. The question now wasn't whether Andrew and Melissa would try again. The question was how far they were willing to go, and how far Robert was willing to go to stop them. And if you think the act at the hospital was chilling, wait until you see what Robert uncovered when the mask of family loyalty finally cracked. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee, a hollow space humming with fluorescent lights that made every face look pale and guilty. Melissa paced with her heels clicking a nervous rhythm across the linoleum, her hand fluttering to her hair, to her phone, to her lips, never still for more than a breath. She spoke in circles, repeating the same lines of concern, her voice pitched just high enough to carry to everyone nearby. Poor Mom, what a shock, how terrible. She just collapsed. Robert sat in silence, his arms folded, watching her body betray her words. The tremor in her fingers, the way her eyes darted to him and away again. The sudden shallow breathing when a doctor walked past. These were not the habits of a grieving daughter. They were the tells of someone terrified that the performance wasn't landing. Andrew sat stiffly in a plastic chair, phone buzzing on his thigh, screen lighting up again and again with messages he never answered. He didn't look at Robert. He didn't look at Melissa for long either, except for those quick glances, those silent exchanges that spoke louder than words. When Robert leaned forward, elbows on his knees, Andrew cleared his throat and said softly, almost too softly, "Dad, maybe you should go home. Get some rest. You don't need to be here for this." The suggestion landed like a stone dropped in still water. Robert turned his head slowly, letting his gaze linger on his son until Andrew shifted uncomfortably. "She's practically family," Robert said evenly. "I'll stay." Melissa jumped in before Andrew could respond. Her smile stretched too tight, her tone too bright. "That's so thoughtful, but really you must be exhausted. After the party, the shock, all of this stress, it's too much for you. Andrew and I can handle everything. You should let us take care of it." Take care of it. The words slithered into Robert's mind, curling around the image of the poisoned glass. He heard the false sweetness in Melissa's voice, saw the relief flicker across her face when Andrew nodded in agreement. They wanted him home, alone, away from the doctors, away from the evidence, away from the truth. They wanted him where they could control the story, where no one would see the way Melissa's hands shook or notice the fear clinging to her voice. He leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable, and let them think he was considering it. Andrew's shoulders eased, Melissa's hands stilled for the briefest second, and Robert realized they had already rehearsed this scene. They had planned for questions, for suspicion, for the need to isolate him if things spiraled. The realization settled cold and heavy in his chest. They had thought this through far more carefully than he had first imagined. A doctor appeared, clipboard in hand, his voice professional but uncertain. "Linda was stable," he said, but the cause was unclear. Toxicology results would take time. "Plant alkaloids," he murmured to a nurse, words not meant for family ears but caught by Robert's sharp attention. Melissa's face paled at the mention, her body stilling like a deer caught in headlights. Robert filed it away, another crack in her mask. When the doctor left, Melissa sank into the chair beside Andrew, her hand brushing his knee. "This is terrible," she whispered. "I can't imagine how this could have happened." Robert tilted his head, studying the curve of her mouth, the faint tremor in her jaw. He could imagine exactly how it happened, and so could she. Andrew tried again, voice firmer this time. "Dad, let us handle this. You don't need to put yourself through the stress. Why don't you go home, get some rest? We'll call if there's any news." Robert said nothing. He let the silence stretch, heavy and suffocating, until Andrew looked away, staring at the wall as though it might offer escape. Robert knew then that he was no longer a father in his son's eyes. He was an obstacle. He was a signature on a will, a bank account with too many zeros, a house filled with assets they thought they deserved, and obstacles were meant to be removed. Tonight had been sloppy, but they would not make the same mistake twice. Hours passed. Linda's condition stabilized, the monitors beeping in steady reassurance behind closed doors. Melissa's pacing slowed, Andrew's phone finally silenced. At dawn, when the first pale light cut through the hospital windows, Melissa turned to Robert again. "Why don't you go home now? You've done so much already. Please, and let us take care of this." Her voice cracked on the last word, but not from emotion, from strain. Robert stood, slow and deliberate, and for a moment they looked relieved. He adjusted his coat, glanced once more at his son, and gave him a look that made Andrew flinch. "You're right," Robert said smoothly. "I should get some rest. But remember, there are some things I never sleep through." He left them sitting there, pale and silent, the weight of his words hanging between them like smoke. The drive home was quiet, the road slick with early morning dew, the world just beginning to wake. But Robert felt no peace. Every honk, every headlight, every shadow in the rearview mirror felt like a warning. He gripped the wheel tighter, the betrayal of his blood sinking deeper into his bones. His son had asked him to leave not out of love, not out of care, but out of strategy. They wanted him alone, cut off, vulnerable. He parked in his driveway as the sun lifted over the horizon, casting long shadows across the garden his wife once tended. The house loomed like a fortress, but he knew better than to feel safe. The danger wasn't outside. It was inside, woven into the smiles of family, hidden in the careful tones of concern, waiting in the glass that almost touched his lips. Robert closed the door behind him, the silence pressing close, and knew this was just the beginning. Melissa's performance at the hospital, Andrew's insistence he go home, the nervous glances, the cracks in their act, it all pointed to one truth. They weren't finished. The party had been only their opening move, and he had just refused to play the role of victim. He poured himself a drink that wasn't champagne, let the burn settle in his chest, and stared at the empty chair across the table. His son's absence was louder than any noise, his betrayal sharper than any blade. And Robert knew, with a certainty that chilled him, the danger wasn't over. It was only waiting, reshaping itself, preparing for another strike. And if you think Melissa's lies at the hospital were dangerous, wait until you see how far Andrew will go when cornered. The house was quiet when Robert stepped inside, the kind of quiet that used to bring him peace. Tonight it pressed in around him like a weight, every shadow stretching long across the walls, every creak of the floorboards echoing louder than it should. He set his keys on the counter, poured himself a drink, and sat at the kitchen table where his wife once spread out bills and shopping lists. The glass in his hand trembled, not from fear, but from the fury settling deeper with every thought. He opened his checkbook, his files, his notes, pages he hadn't looked at in years, because he had never needed to justify generosity. But now every line item screamed betrayal. There it was, in black and white. Tuition for his granddaughter's private school, paid without question when Andrew said the public schools weren't good enough. The down payment on the Westfield house, covered when Melissa cried about needing the right neighborhood. Credit card balances cleared when Andrew admitted business had been tight. A new car, a boutique expansion, vacations disguised as business trips. Nearly $200,000 siphoned out of Robert's life over the past 5 years, never as loans, never as bargains, but as gifts, because that's what fathers do. Except to Andrew and Melissa, they weren't gifts at all. They were down payments on his death. Robert leaned back, staring at the ceiling, the sting in his chest heavier than the liquor burning his throat. They hadn't seen kindness. They hadn't seen love. They had seen a slow inheritance, a drip feed of wealth they thought was theirs to claim before the will was even read. The knowledge hollowed him out, a gnawing ache sharper than any betrayal he'd faced in business. Strangers stabbing you in the back was expected. Family carving at you piece by piece, smiling while they did it. That was something else entirely. He opened the folder containing Andrew's architectural firm's financials, information he had access to through old contacts who still respected him. The numbers told a story Andrew never confessed. Losses stacked year after year, projects stalled, clients dried up. The recession had cut him at the knees, and instead of rebuilding, Andrew borrowed, refinanced, pretended. Melissa's jewelry boutique wasn't even a business. It was a hobby disguised as an empire, burning money faster than it ever earned it. Their life, with its imported cars, its cathedral ceilings, its designer vacations, had been propped up not by work, but by Robert's silence. He remembered the way Melissa's voice trembled at the hospital, how her hands shook when she brushed her hair back, and suddenly it all made sense. It wasn't Linda's collapse that rattled her. It was the thought that their carefully constructed illusion might come apart before they could cash in on the real prize, Robert. He felt bitterness bloom, cold and steady, not the hot anger of a man wronged in the moment, but the enduring sting of exploitation that stretched years into the past. Every sacrifice he had made to build his fortune, every sleepless night, every calculated risk, had been twisted into entitlement by the very people who should have respected it most. The silence of the house pressed tighter as he flipped through bank statements, donations to causes he cared about, plans for a retirement he had barely allowed himself to imagine. And in the margins of all that work stood Andrew and Melissa, hands outstretched, eyes fixed not on him, but on what he represented. Money, security, an inheritance they believed was their right, not his to protect. Robert poured another drink and sat in the study, the walls lined with leather-bound books and framed awards. None of it mattered now. What mattered was the ledger of betrayal playing out in his mind. The realization that every time he wrote a check, every time he said yes, every time he told himself he was helping his son stand taller, he was only teaching him to lean harder. He thought he had been building Andrew into a man who could carry weight. Instead, he had raised someone who wanted to strip him of it. The bitterness stung, but beneath it was sorrow, a sorrow that cut deeper than the sharpest blade. Robert had loved his son with a blind devotion, had forgiven failures, overlooked flaws, excused weaknesses. He thought love would be enough to hold Andrew steady. But love had become a weapon turned against him, a softness exploited, a generosity twisted into obligation. The thought of it made his chest ache. He could see his wife's face in his mind, hear her voice telling him to be patient, to believe in Andrew, to keep faith in family. She had believed love could fix anything. Tonight Robert understood it could not. He walked to the window, staring out at the garden his wife once tended, the roses blooming wild now without her careful hands. The sight tightened something in his chest. He thought of the family dinners that once filled this house with laughter, the Christmas mornings where Andrew tore open gifts with eyes wide and innocent. That boy was gone. In his place sat a man who let his wife pour poison into a glass and looked away. Robert turned back to the papers spread across his desk, to the evidence of years of quiet exploitation, and the bitterness hardened into resolve. They thought they had mapped out their future, drawn it in neat lines across his fortune, but they had forgotten one thing. He was not finished. Not yet. He poured the last of the bottle into his glass and sat again at the table, pen in hand, legal pad before him. He began to write, not numbers this time, but names, connections, plans. Every betrayal carved into ink, every weakness catalogued, every debt recorded. His mind moved with the precision of the man who had survived the ruthless tides of business for decades. If Andrew and Melissa thought he would surrender quietly, they had gravely miscalculated. The night stretched long, the house still, but for the scratch of pen against paper. Robert felt the sorrow ebb, replaced by something sharper, cleaner. He would not let them reduce him to a signature on a will, a man waiting for death in a chair by the window. He would not be their advance inheritance. He would show them that age was not weakness, that 70 years had sharpened him, not dulled him. The glass emptied, the list grew, and Robert sat in the dim light, his face set, his resolve unshakable. Somewhere across town, Andrew and Melissa slept in the house he had helped them buy, dreaming of fortunes they thought already theirs. Robert smiled without warmth. Let them sleep. Let them believe. The truth was waiting, patient and sharp, and when it struck, it would cut deeper than they ever imagined. And if you think the discovery of their debts explains everything, wait until you see the lengths they're willing to go to cover them. The next morning brought the sound of the doorbell, sharp and insistent, cutting through the silence of Robert's home. He opened it to find Andrew standing on the porch with a box of pastries from Robert's favorite bakery. A smile stretched across his face that didn't reach his eyes. The scent of sugar and butter filled the hallway as Andrew stepped inside, setting the box on the kitchen counter like a peace offering. Robert made coffee, watching his son move around the kitchen with the ease of someone who had grown up there, opening cabinets without asking, reaching for sugar like he had a right to it. For a fleeting second, Robert saw the boy Andrew used to be, The child who once ran into this kitchen with scraped knees and drawings from school. But that vision vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the man standing before him now, carrying not just pastries, but an agenda. They sat across from each other at the breakfast table, coffee steaming between them. Andrew picked at a Danish, his voice soft with rehearsed concern. "How are you holding up, Dad? Yesterday must have been a lot. We've all been worried." Robert nodded, silent, waiting. Andrew leaned forward, hands clasped like a man about to deliver difficult news. "Jessica and I have been talking. You're 70 now, living alone in this big house. After what happened to Linda, we just don't think it's safe anymore. What if it had been you? What if you collapsed and no one found you for hours?" Robert let the words hang in the air, sipping his coffee, his face unreadable. Andrew mistook his silence for agreement and pressed on. "There are places, really wonderful communities for active seniors. Not nursing homes, more like resorts. They have golf courses, spas, cultural activities, even medical staff on site. You'd have people around, you wouldn't be isolated. We've done some research." He pulled out his phone, the screen glowing with a glossy website filled with smiling older couples playing bridge and floating in turquoise pools. "It's called Sunset Manor. It's close to us. We could visit all the time. You'd love it there." Robert studied the photos, the airbrushed faces of seniors who looked more like actors than residents, their contentment too polished to be real. He heard Andrew's words, but underneath them, he heard something else. Control. This wasn't about safety or companionship. This was about money, about removing him from his home and tucking him neatly into a place where his assets could be managed by someone else. Andrew hesitated, then added, "The only thing is, there's usually a waiting list. But they do have an opening right now. To secure it, we'd need to pay the entrance fee up front, $400,000. It covers everything for life. Housing, meals, medical care. Once you're settled, everything else is taken care of." His tone softened even further. "It would give us peace of mind, knowing you're safe. No, and it would give you peace of mind, too." Robert set his cup down slowly, his hands steady. $400,000. A dent in his liquid assets. A neat transfer from his account into theirs, hidden behind the facade of care. He knew exactly what would follow. The papers granting power of attorney, the signatures that would give Andrew control of his money, his property, his freedom. His son's voice wrapped it in love, but beneath the softness, Robert could hear the clink of chains. He stared at Andrew, memorizing the lines of his face, the sincerity that might have fooled anyone else. Grief pressed at his chest, heavier than anger. His son, the boy he had raised, was willing to sacrifice him for money. Not kill him outright, not like Melissa had tried, but bury him alive in a gilded cage, strip him of independence, reduce him to a managed asset in a ledger. The betrayal was almost worse because it came wrapped in concern, because Andrew convinced himself he was doing it out of love. Robert forced a smile, nodding as though the suggestion was worth considering. "It sounds lovely," he said, his voice even. "I'll think about it. It's a big decision." Relief washed over Andrew's face, his shoulders easing, his smile growing warmer. He believed he had planted the seed, that Robert was already swaying. He didn't see the fire building behind his father's eyes, didn't hear the steel in his measured tone. They ate the rest of breakfast in silence, Robert watching his son carefully, studying every gesture, every look. The pastries tasted of ash in his mouth. When Andrew stood to leave, he patted Robert's shoulder, the touch meant to be affectionate, but landing like a shackle. "We'll go visit next week," he said brightly. "Just to look around. No pressure." Robert walked him to the door, watched him step onto the porch, watched him glance back with that earnest expression he had perfected. Then the car pulled away, leaving Robert in the doorway with the weight of realization pressing down harder than ever. He closed the door, the latch clicking like a lock on a cell. He walked back to the kitchen, staring at the pastries left on the counter, and felt a deep ache spread through his chest. His son wasn't trying to protect him. He was trying to bury him. The retirement community, the entrance fee, the power of attorney, it was all a neatly wrapped package of betrayal, disguised as care. And Robert knew now that Andrew would stop at nothing, not even the destruction of his own father's independence, to get what he wanted. Robert poured the rest of his coffee down the sink, the bitter liquid swirling into the drain. He stood at the window, looking out at the garden, and felt the sorrow harden into resolve once more. They thought they were clever, thought they had cornered him, thought age had dulled his mind. They had no idea. He had built his life by seeing through illusions, by cutting through masks to the truth beneath. He saw through Andrew now as clearly as he had seen through Melissa's trembling act at the champagne table. The betrayal hurt more than he would ever admit, but it also sharpened him. It reminded him of who he was. If Andrew believed that pastries and false kindness could lull him into surrender, he was gravely mistaken. Robert would let them play their game, let them think they had the upper hand, and then he would show them just how ruthless 70 years of survival had made him. He turned from the window, the morning light stretching across the floor like bars on a cage, and he knew he would never step into Sunset Manor. He would never hand over his life for them to dismantle. If they wanted his money, they would have to try harder, reach deeper, and risk everything. And if you think the pitch for a luxury retirement home was shameless, wait until you see the lengths Melissa and Andrew will go when their first plan begins to unravel. David Clark's office was 15 stories above the city, a wall of glass looking out over steel and concrete, the kind of place designed to project calm power. Robert sat across from him, the polished table between them reflecting the hard lines of his face. He laid it all out, Melissa's trembling hands with the champagne glass, Linda's collapse, Andrew's suggestion about Sunset Manor, the $400,000 entrance fee, the pastries meant to sweeten the poison. David listened without interrupting, his pen moving across the yellow legal pad with steady strokes. When Robert finished, the room was heavy with silence, broken only by the muffled hum of traffic below. "You're certain about what you saw?" David asked finally, his voice measured, precise. "As certain as I am sitting here," Robert said. His tone carried no doubt, no hesitation. David leaned back, tapping his pen against his lips. The kind of pause Robert had seen 1,000 times in boardrooms, a man weighing the weight of truth against the risks of proof. "The problem isn't whether you're right," David said slowly. "The problem is whether you can prove it. Even if you test the champagne and it comes back poisoned, Melissa could claim it was something harmless, some supplement or flavoring. Without evidence of intent, it's a thin case." Robert's jaw tightened. Intent was written all over her face. "I don't disagree," David said, "but courts don't run on instinct. And there's something else you need to consider." He set the pen down, folding his hands. "If Melissa and Andrew are desperate enough to try poison, they may also be desperate enough to try something more subtle, legal guardianship." Robert raised an eyebrow. "Guardianship?" "Yes. They could argue you're no longer competent to manage your own affairs. You're 70, living alone, recently sold your company. They could point to stress, fatigue, memory lapses, manufactured or exaggerated, and claim you're slipping. If a sympathetic doctor signs off, if a court agrees, they can take control of your finances legally. You'd be alive, but powerless." The words sank into Robert like ice water. He had spent decades building an empire, clawing his way up from nothing, outmaneuvering rivals, surviving betrayals. To imagine himself stripped of agency, reduced to a ward of the very people plotting against him, was almost worse than death. He gripped the arm of his chair, steadying himself against the wave of dread. David's voice softened, but his eyes stayed sharp. "I've seen it happen, Robert. Families staging confusion, lining up medical reports, convincing judges an elderly parent is unfit. Once guardianship is granted, they control everything. Your money, your home, even where you live. And once you're tucked away in a place like Sunset Manor, it becomes that much easier to make the case." Robert leaned back, the anger hardening into resolve. "So what do I do?" "We protect you," David said. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder. "First, we establish a baseline of your mental competency. I'll arrange for a geriatric psychiatrist to evaluate you, someone impartial and unimpeachable. That record will make it much harder for anyone to claim you're unfit. Then we restructure your estate, set up trusts they can't penetrate, directives that spell out exactly who can and cannot make decisions for you. If Andrew and Melissa want to play games with your future, we make sure they're playing by your rules." For the first time since the party, Robert felt the weight shift. Anxiety still pressed against his ribs, but beneath it was something steadier. Empowerment. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was preparing. They spent the next 2 hours hammering through the details, David guiding, Robert deciding. Medical directives specifying who had authority. Financial arrangements that triggered audits if anyone tried to tamper with his accounts. A revised will, stripping Andrew's inheritance down to something modest, enough to live, but not enough to squander. The bulk redirected to charities Robert trusted, organizations that would outlive the schemes of greedy relatives. Every stroke of the pen was a shield, every clause a blade. By the time Robert left the office, the sun was sinking behind the skyline, turning the glass towers to fire. He stepped into the chill of evening with his coat pulled tight, his mind sharper than it had felt in days. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had been harnessed, turned into action. Melissa and Andrew thought they were shepherding him toward the end, nudging him into a cage lined with velvet. They had no idea he was already building walls they couldn't climb, traps they couldn't see. Driving home, Robert caught himself studying the rearview mirror. Every car behind him a question, every shadow a warning. It wasn't paranoia, not anymore. He knew the danger was real, knew that somewhere Melissa and Andrew were recalculating, whispering, plotting their next move. But now he was ready. He had allies, he had safeguards, and he had time. Time to turn their greed into their undoing. He parked in his driveway, the house looming like a fortress against the deepening dark. For the first time in days, he didn't feel like a prisoner in it. He felt like a man preparing for war. He poured himself a drink, sat in his study, and looked at the legal documents spread across his desk. His signature scrawled across the pages, like a promise, not just to himself, but to the legacy he refused to let them steal. Melissa had tried to poison him. Andrew had tried to bury him in luxury. But Robert was still standing, still thinking, still fighting. And if they thought guardianship would be their path to victory, they were about to learn that the man they underestimated had been preparing for battles like this his entire life. The night settled in around him, the house humming with its quiet defenses, the garden beyond still blooming in the dark. Robert sipped his drink and let the silence sharpen him. The war wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. And if you think the threat of legal guardianship was chilling, wait until you see the next move Melissa and Andrew make when they realize their grip on his fortune is slipping. The knock came mid-afternoon, sharp and deliberate, echoing through the quiet house Robert had spent decades protecting. He already knew who it was. He had been expecting it since the moment Andrew showed him the glossy photos of Sunset Manor, since the moment David Clark warned him about guardianship. He opened the door to find Andrew and Melissa standing on the porch. Their smiles stretched thin, both dressed as if for a business meeting rather than a family visit. Melissa clutched a leather briefcase, her eyes bright with a nervous gleam that betrayed eagerness more than concern. "Dad," Andrew said warmly, almost too warmly, "we thought we'd stop by, just to go over a few things." Robert stepped aside, letting them enter. He kept his face smooth, his tone even, but every sense was sharp, every nerve taut. Melissa set the briefcase on the dining room table and pulled out a stack of papers, laying them down like a dealer spreading cards. Contracts, forms, authorizations. Andrew stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, the posture of a man trying to appear steady while leaning on someone else's strength. "These are just some documents to make things easier," Melissa began, her voice dripping with practiced reassurance. "Admission forms for Sunset Manor, financial disclosures so they know you'll be comfortable there, and a power of attorney. Nothing complicated, just standard procedure." She pushed the thickest stack forward, the paper sliding across the polished wood toward Robert. He sat down slowly, took his glasses from his pocket, and studied the first page. The words were precise, the language heavy with legal jargon, but the meaning was crystal clear. Immediate authority, full access. His bank accounts, his investments, his decisions shifted into Andrew's hands with the stroke of a pen. He felt his chest tighten, but his expression never wavered. "This is quite comprehensive," he said, his voice calm, almost curious. "It gives you a lot of authority, Andrew." Andrew leaned forward, his smile earnest, his tone soft. "It's just a precaution, Dad. The facility requires it, and honestly, it's easier if someone younger handles the complicated stuff. You shouldn't have to worry about this at your age." "At your age?" The words pressed like thorns against Robert's mind. They wanted him to believe he was fragile, incapable, one step from incompetence. But he was sharper now than he had ever been. He nodded as though considering, flipping another page, letting them think he was wavering. Melissa's eyes flicked to Andrew's, a silent exchange of triumph. She believed he was already folding, already surrendering to their careful script. Robert let the silence stretch, the tension in the room thick as smoke. Finally, he set the papers down and reached for his pen. "I'll need to look these over thoroughly," he said, his voice measured. "But you're right, it's probably wise to prepare. Why don't we review them together?" Melissa's relief was almost tangible. She leaned back slightly, her shoulders easing, a smile curling at her lips. Andrew exhaled as if a weight had lifted. They believed the battle was over, that the fortress had finally cracked. Robert signed where they indicated, his signature neat and deliberate, and handed the pages back with steady hands. Inside, his blood ran cold. He had just handed them a weapon, but it was a weapon loaded with blanks. David Clark's handiwork. The documents had the appearance of power, the authority Andrew craved, but behind the polished legalese lay nothing but shadows. They gave control over a single account with a single dollar, a shell that would trap them the moment they tried to wield it. Robert watched Andrew slide the signed papers into the briefcase with trembling hands, watched Melissa's smile bloom, and forced himself to mirror their calm. The dread hung heavy, even as determination steeled his spine. He had no illusions. This wasn't their last move. Once they believed they held control, they would press harder, push further, and their desperation would drive them into mistakes. He needed them to believe, needed them to think victory was within reach. Only then could he expose them fully. As they sipped the coffee he offered, Melissa played the role of dutiful daughter-in-law, her laughter light, her hand brushing Andrew's arm as if they were any ordinary couple sharing an afternoon with family. But Robert saw the hunger in their eyes, the way their gazes lingered on the documents tucked safely away in the briefcase. He heard the eagerness in Andrew's voice, the edge beneath the charm. the relief of a drowning man clutching a lifeline. They left after an hour, promises of dinner next week and visits to Sunset Manor floating in the air like false perfume. Robert walked them to the door, smiling, shaking Andrew's hand, letting Melissa kiss his cheek. He stood in the doorway long after their car disappeared down the street, the briefcase riding shotgun between them like a treasure chest. Inside, he poured himself a drink and sat in his study, the silence pressing close once again. His hand trembled, only once, lifting the glass, before he steadied it against the wood of the desk. They had shown their hand. They believed they had him cornered. That belief was his weapon now. He thought of his wife, of the boy Andrew once was, of the countless sacrifices that had built this life. The grief threatened to rise, but he pushed it down. There would be time for sorrow later. For now, there was only the game, and Robert intended to win. The trap was set, the pieces moving, the tension twisting tighter with every breath. He had signed their papers, given them what they thought they wanted, but the true power remained in his hands. And if you think the sight of Robert quietly signing away his fortune was the end, wait until you see what happens when the police arrive at his door with evidence that shatters every illusion Melissa and Andrew so carefully constructed. The knock on Robert's door came just after dusk, heavy and certain, the kind of knock that carried authority. He opened it to find two detectives standing on the porch, their coats still damp from the evening rain, badges flashing in the porch light. The taller one, a man with sharp eyes and a clipped tone, asked if they could come inside. Robert stepped aside without a word, leading them into the study where the fire burned low in the hearth. The detective spread out papers across his desk, photographs clipped to reports, documents stapled into neat piles. The words were precise and damning. Melissa had purchased a vial of digitalis from an unlicensed supplier 2 weeks before the party. Toxicology confirmed the same poison in Linda's system. And then came the hammer blow. A life insurance policy for $500,000, naming Robert as the insured and Melissa as the sole beneficiary. Robert sat back, the chair creaking under his weight, his face a mask of stillness. Inside, the truth cut deep, sharper than even he had expected. She hadn't just tried to kill him, she had planned to profit from it, to turn his death into a payday. The detectives laid the policy in front of him, the signatures crisp, the date recent. Melissa had forged his consent, signed her name to his future, as though she already owned it. The sound of tires crunching the gravel outside pulled Robert's gaze toward the window. Andrew's car. The headlights swept across the study walls as his son pulled into the drive. Robert said nothing. He simply waited. The door opened moments later, Andrew's voice carrying into the hallway. "Dad, we thought we'd—" His words faltered as he stepped into the study and saw the detectives, their expressions unreadable, their papers spread wide like a case already decided. His eyes flicked to the documents, to the insurance policy, to Robert's steady stare, and then he saw Melissa's name. She came in behind him, her smile faltering the instant she saw the evidence laid bare. For a split second she froze, her eyes darting from the detectives to Robert, her breath catching in her throat. Then she tried to recover, shaking her head, her voice high and trembling. "This isn't what it looks like. Someone is setting us up. Dad, you don't believe this, do you?" The detective cut her off. "We have toxicology reports, purchase records, and the insurance policy. Melissa Wilson, you're under arrest for attempted murder and insurance fraud." The words cracked through the air like thunder. Melissa's face drained of color as the detective produced handcuffs, his voice reciting her rights with mechanical precision. She reached for Andrew, her hands trembling, her voice breaking. "Say something. Tell them this isn't true." But Andrew said nothing. He stood rooted to the spot, his face pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. His silence was louder than any confession. Robert watched him, searching his son's eyes for denial, for outrage, for anything that might suggest innocence. All he saw was shame. As the detectives pulled Melissa's arms behind her back, she turned her head toward Robert, her eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and fury. "You did this," she spat. "You turned him against me." Robert didn't flinch. His voice was calm, steady, final. "No, you did this to yourself." They let her out, her cries echoing down the hallway, fading as the front door slammed shut. The sound of the squad car pulling away lingered in the night like a closing curtain. Andrew sank into the chair opposite his father, his shoulders collapsing, his hands covering his face. For the first time, Robert saw not the ambitious son or the scheming husband, but the broken man beneath, crumbling under the weight of his own choices. The silence stretched long, filled only by the crackle of the fire. Finally, Andrew spoke, his voice raw. "I didn't know about the insurance. I swear I didn't. But I knew about the money. I knew what she planned with Sunset Manor. I didn't stop her. I thought maybe it would solve everything." Robert's chest tightened, sorrow pressing heavy against his ribs. He had wanted vindication, but standing here in the ruins of his family, the victory tasted like ash. His son's silence had condemned him as surely as any signature, and now there was no undoing it. "You are my blood," Robert said quietly. "My only son. And you stood by while she tried to erase me." Andrew's eyes brimmed with tears, but no words came. He bowed his head, broken, the shame consuming him. Robert rose, moving to the window, staring out at the darkened garden. The roses swayed in the wind, shadows bending across the grass. He thought of his wife, of the family they had built, of the boy Andrew once was. The boy was gone, replaced by a man who traded love for greed. The detectives had left justice in their wake, but justice came at a price. Melissa was in custody, Andrew was shattered, and Robert stood in the middle of the wreckage, victorious yet hollow. Vindication burned in his veins, but so did grief, the kind that lingered long after the battle ended. He turned back, watching Andrew sit hunched in the chair, a man stripped bare by shame. Robert's voice was low, sharp, each word deliberate. "You've lost everything, not because of me, but because you let her take you down with her." The fire crackled louder, filling the silence that followed. Robert knew the fight wasn't over. Arrests and evidence were one thing, but the rot in his family ran deeper than Melissa's schemes. Andrew was still here, still his son, still a weakness that could be exploited. He clenched his jaw, staring into the flames. The war for his fortune, for his legacy, for his very name, wasn't finished. Melissa's arrest was only the beginning, the first crack in a foundation that had already been weakened. And if you think her handcuffs ended the danger, wait until you see what Robert discovers about the enemies circling beyond his own blood. The garden had begun to bloom again by the time spring rolled across the hills, roses climbing the trellis in shades his wife once loved. Robert moved slowly among them, pruning shears in hand, the morning sun cutting across his face. Months had passed since the night Melissa was led away in handcuffs and Andrew sat collapsed in shame across from him. The house was quiet now, but the silence no longer pressed like a weight. It felt earned, as though he had carved it out of chaos with his own hands. The money was safe. David Clark had seen to that. The trusts were locked, layered, and protected, each one sealed with ironclad directives that made Melissa and Andrew ghosts to his fortune. They could claw, they could beg, they could try to manipulate the courts, but they would find nothing left within their reach. What once had been a dangling inheritance had become a fortress of ink and law, untouchable, impenetrable. Robert had lived his life building defenses, and now, in the twilight of it, he had built his strongest one. He knelt by the roses, trimming the branches, the thorns pricking his gloves, the smell of earth rich and grounding. It wasn't just survival that lingered in him. It was vindication. He had stared betrayal in the eye and refused to flinch. He had turned their schemes into ash, their greed into their undoing. But even in the victory, there was a sadness, a hollow space where love for his son used to live. The sound of small footsteps broke the stillness. He looked up to see his granddaughter running across the yard, her laughter bright as wind chimes, her arms open wide. She leapt into his embrace, and he caught her easily, lifting her high before setting her down among the roses. Her innocence was untouched by the ugliness of her parents' choices. She still looked at him with love untainted by greed, her smile proof that not everything had been poisoned. They walked together through the rows of flowers, her small hand tucked into his, her questions bubbling out one after another. What kind of rose was this? Why did the petals fall so quickly? Could she take one home? Robert answered each with patience, his voice softer now than it had been in months. He realized then that the real victory wasn't in locking away his money, or outsmarting Melissa's poison, or seeing Andrew's silence exposed. The real victory was this moment, this proof that age did not mean weakness, that dignity could not be stolen, that he could still stand tall for the ones who deserved his strength. As the sun climbed higher, he sat with his granddaughter on the porch, a pitcher of lemonade between them, the air filled with the buzz of bees and the rustle of leaves. She leaned against him, her head resting on his arm, her trust absolute. He smiled faintly, bittersweet pride washing over him. He had protected not just his fortune, but the legacy that mattered. The chance for her to grow up knowing her grandfather was not a man who surrendered, not a man who allowed betrayal to define him. Inside, the house was filled with reminders of what had been lost. Photographs of Andrew as a boy, drawings tucked into boxes, echoes of laughter that would never return the same way again. Robert carried the grief with him like a scar, visible only to him, but no longer an open wound. He had accepted that not every battle ended with reconciliation. Some ended with silence, with distance, with the hard choice of protecting yourself when love had failed. The garden thrived around him, a living testament to resilience. New buds pushed through soil that had once lain frozen. Vines climbed higher, roots dug deeper. Robert saw himself in those roses, scarred by thorns but still blooming, still reaching for the light. He sipped his lemonade and let the peace of the moment sink into him. For all the darkness that had come, for all the betrayal he had endured, he was still here, still standing. When his granddaughter asked if he would teach her how to grow roses of her own, he nodded, his throat tightening with emotion he didn't let her see. "Of course," he said. "Someday, you'll have a garden bigger than this one." She smiled, her eyes wide with excitement, and Robert felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing he was planning something that would outlive him. Not wealth, not property, but strength, resilience, and love unbroken by greed. The sky turned gold as the day waned, the shadows stretching long across the yard. Robert rose, brushing the dirt from his hands, and looked out over the land he had protected. He thought of Melissa in a cell, of Andrew adrift in his shame, of the night it all nearly ended with a poisoned glass. They had tried to erase him, to bury him, to make him small. Instead, they had awakened something sharper, something unbreakable. He lifted his granddaughter into his arms and carried her back inside, her laughter still bright, still free. The house no longer felt empty. It felt alive, renewed, a place reclaimed. As the door shut behind them, Robert understood the truth with absolute clarity. The victory wasn't only that he had survived. The victory was that he had proven survival could be defiant, powerful, and filled with grace. Age was not weakness. Age was strength forged through battles most would never endure. And if you think Robert's story ended in peace among roses, wait until you see how the seeds he planted that spring grew into something far greater than any fortune he had ever earned. Robert's story is more than a tale of betrayal and survival. It is a reminder that growing older does not mean becoming powerless. Life will test us, sometimes in the cruelest ways, and the deepest wounds may even come from those closest to us. Yet, what truly defines us is not how much we lose, but how we rise, protect what matters, and refuse to let others strip away our dignity. For older Americans, this story is a call to guard both our finances and our independence, to put safeguards in place, and to remember that wisdom gained over a lifetime is its own kind of armor. Just as Robert secured his legacy through careful planning, we too can protect ourselves by being cautious, by preparing, and by never underestimating our own resilience. Most importantly, Robert found peace in passing on values of strength and love to the next generation. That is the victory age gives us, the chance to plant something lasting beyond wealth. If this story resonates with you, share it with a friend, subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments. What lesson about family and strength has life taught you?